happy to have Robert Clowes here for the Lisbon AI Seminar. Robert is the head of the Lisbon Mind, Cognition and Knowledge Group at the IFILNOVA, at the Institute of Philosophy Nova. And he will talk to us today about deep learning and deep minds and for cognitive science.
Okay, thanks, Klaus. Thanks, everybody at CSU. Thanks for inviting me. Good to see Victor as well. All fabulous stuff. Okay. So, yes, today we're talking about AI, deep learning, and all of that kind of stuff. Just in a way, following on a bit from Victor last time, we gave us a very nice kind of potted history of how we got here and some of the challenges. Some of that I'm going to cover a little bit today, but this is slightly from a different perspective. So this is more from the perspective of philosophy, which at various points has been very, very deeply involved with artificial intelligence and its different moods and its different trends, sometimes constructively, sometimes less so. And really, I guess if the sort of, not the take-home message as such, but the kind of motto of this is, what is philosophy to make of these new dramatic changes which are taking place at this very moment over the last couple of months has come to many people's attention. Possibly, I didn't have time to drop this in because I was writing a grant proposal the last week, but possibly the new AI spring after the various AI winters. You know, George R.R. Martin's book may never arrive, but perhaps spring is finally here in some sense. Okay. In many ways, I thought before jumping into describing the main thing of today, I just talk about an unheralded technology which appeared on my mobile phone a week or so, a few months back, called Google Lens. Google Lens, rather unheralded, sits in your hand. You can attach it to your camera. You can point the thing. It's an app on the new Google phones. You can point the thing at almost any object, and it will tell you what that object is. This works with animals, vegetables, and minerals. It works with pieces of art. It works with, well, I pointed at lots of plants, and it's pretty damn good with these things. It works with almost anything manufactured by IKEA and many other manufacturers. You just point it, and it will give you, it tells you not only what it is, but it will tell you how to buy it, which of course is the commercial motivation of these things. I think, I mean, I will defer to Victor here, but I think, you know, for most people, certainly most people in philosophy, even people like me in philosophy who've been looking at artificial intelligence for a long time, for many researchers in artificial intelligence, for many researchers in cognitive science, this is something of a miracle, right? You would not really have expected that this technology would do this 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, possibly even 12 months ago. So it's kind of crept up on us. There's this kind of slightly miraculous technology. And yes, it seems that the scope of this technology seems to be in some sense ever widening, right? It can be applied in more and more places and in more and more contexts and used for more and more things. There's a really nice paper that I forgot, it has about 20 authors that Paula sent to me about a month back with, I think, lots of people at Google or maybe people at OpenAI authored it, which they were talking about the ever widening scope, you know, towards kind of general AI. And if what we're talking about is the field of application, the different places that you can apply this stuff, it's pretty amazing. And it is looking like it's tending in that kind of general direction. You know, lots of caveats that we should add in here, but it does seem to have this tendency. And one thing that I've sort of become really aware of reading up, particularly on some of the history of this over the last few months, is that much of this technology is actually sort of motivated and built by people really looking at computer vision in many ways, right? So it wasn't even, you could argue, wasn't even supposed to work with language, right? So the fact that all of this stuff has just popped out of it, you know, is very interesting. And perhaps, although it's not one of the classic 4 E's in cognitive science, perhaps emergence is one of the questions that we should most readily talk about in this context. So still can't go forward. Don't know how to go forward. Oh, there we go. All right, so this is the menu today. So this, I'm going to really condense the first part of this, but the idea of this is really I have kind of other research interests here, but for the purposes of today, I'm kind of interested in Fourier cognitive science and what Fourier cognitive science and particularly Fourier philosophy has to say about this, this new AI. And I think certainly for some streams of Fourier cognitive science, it's pretty surprising, like it was in every other place. So I think these kind of surprising moments are very interesting for science. You don't predict something's going to happen, and then it happens. I think actually, without going too deeply into the philosophy of science, these are very interesting moments that can actually generate ideas, because sometimes the empirical world actually runs ahead of theory. And so that's kind of interesting here. After talking about that, I'm going to talk about the AI challenge. In fact, I've already told you partly about the AI challenge. The AI challenge, in my terms, is to explain what I've just mentioned, that we suddenly have popping out of almost nowhere these systems that could do a lot of things you didn't expect they'd be able to do. So that's pretty interesting. Then I'm going to look particularly from the point of view of Fourier cognitive science and how we might face up to this challenge. And I'll suggest that there are 3 ways of going forward. One of which I think is a very bad way. 2 has something to be said for it, and 3, of course, is the way that I would like to go. So I'll try to go through this, going through the first bit a bit quickly. Oh yes, I've been playing around with Dall-E about 4 or 5 months ago, like everybody else. And this is one of my favorites. John Searle, defeated by AI in the style of Picasso Blue Period. I had various goes at this, but this is quite a nice one somehow. And so the idea is we're going to go back and look at some of the early days of Fourier cognitive. Sorry? If you want to go back? No, I don't. And we're going back conceptually, back to the 1990s, back to the days when Rodney Brooks was the bad boy of AI, and was tremendously influential, building these kind of robots, like this robot here, this creature, so-called creature. And it kind of, my argument is that, in a nutshell, the Fourier cognitive science kind of started at the margins of cognitive science. It started with robotics on the one hand, and it started with social anthropology on the other. And they come in from the margins, and that's what creates, maybe with a bit of Buddhism thrown in, but that's what kind of creates the movement in Fourier. And so Rodney Brooks is hugely influential, partly because he builds these creatures. And the thing about the creatures are, they are an existence proof of something you can do. So the argument is, you can build systems, robots, to act in the real world, which at the time was kind of the real world, something out there beyond our systems of representation. These things could walk around in a kind of complex environment. Bless you. The important thing from a conceptual point of view was that Rodney Brooks wrote these papers. I hope I have them on here, not quite here, but with names like Intelligence Without Representation, Intelligence Without Reason. And these papers were kind of a front-on challenge to the then cognitive science establishment, symbol systems, all of this. And the idea that Rodney Brooks was arguing against is that you can have representational systems which kind of massively represented the world, and kind of you produce these kind of internal models, then you act on them, and we're able to act in the real world. This seemed to be the theoretical assumption of Fourier cognitive science, and Brooks argued this is wrong. He built creatures like this. They had little modules of behavior which would constrain each other, but there's no, I mean, people argued against this, but I think there's no reasonable sense in which they had anything like a synthesized representation of the world. They exchanged information in some ways, but it was not really in a representational way. So I think, this is an existence proof. You could build insect-like intelligence with these kind of systems. And Brooks argued that, it could be like this all the way up, or at least a very long way up, right? So maybe representational approaches were kind of mistaken. And I'm going to really go through this here, but very, very quickly, because I've given this talk a few times now. But in any case, I think the key messages, the messages come out of Brooks were things like, the key idea here is that, these systems use the world as its own best model. They do not need to build lots of internal models, because the world is always there and it's the best model. And you hear this phrase over and over again. And I think if it wasn't Rodney Brooks that coined it, he certainly made it very popular. I just read out the bit in black. These are quotes from this paper, Intelligence Without Representation, which is one of the most famous papers. Just as there is no central representation, there is not even a central system. Each activity producing layer, one of those layers I just showed you in the picture, connects perception to action directly. It is only the observer of the creature who imputes the central representation. So this idea of seeing, many cognitive scientists and philosophers see representation in the system, that's observer dependent according to Brooks. And he goes on to say, this is the wrong unit of abstraction, the wrong scientific idea to build systems like this. And so we can go on about this, but I'm going to just skip through. So very roughly, the Brooksian, hugely influential Brooksian view is that the world is its own best model. Agency is distributed between the angel and the world in many ways. Agency, that is. There is no central model. There might be lots of little models, but they don't necessarily share representations or even information internally. Maybe they actually share information by acting on the world in various ways. There's no dense information integration. In fact, that's the thing that Brooks, more than anything else, is kind of against. To be really fair to him, that he's not saying that this doesn't happen in human beings. What he's saying is there's all kinds of intelligent systems in the world, and it's probably not happening in these systems, right? At least that's like the research hypothesis. So that's what's driving the idea. And he thinks there are a whole bunch of new essences of intelligence. This is sort of 10 years down the line. He talks about embodiment, embedding, dynamics, development, all of these things. Okay, another one of my lovely pictures made with Dall-E. This one was Sean Gallagher holds back the tide of generative AI. Well, you may think I'm picking on Sean Gallagher, but he was the only 4E philosopher that I could find famous enough to actually make one of these pictures with. So that's part of the reason he's there. Anyway, I quite like that one. And on the left is when Brooks was very sexy, fast, cheap, and out of control, and that sort of robotics would take over the world. Another cell defeated by AI. Okay, so we're now in another new moment. This is the moment of the mind's uncanny valley. This is the moment very much in the realm of the mind technology problem, where suddenly we have all kinds of artifacts doing things that very short time ago we wouldn't have thought they could do, and are generally associated with humans' creative potential, human-type cognition, viz, or witness these kind of creative systems that I can type a text in and it can produce something that looks very much like, perhaps it's not really very good, and you can see signs here of something that's doesn't look like it would be produced by a human artist, but nevertheless, it does something interesting that could be said. I mean, I'm not going to go into this, but Maggie Bode's could be argued to be creative. I may have come up with some creative bit of text, but the system has done quite a bit of work here. So it's a mixed model of creativity. So we're in this moment, right? We've got all of this stuff happening, produced by artifacts, produced by algorithms that we need to kind of understand, that we need to explain. And part of it, a big part of it, is to do with what Sejnowsk calls the deep learning revolution. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this now. So the person that they're now calling the godfather of AI is Geoffrey Hinton. Geoffrey Hinton, tremendously important, actually, along with Sejnowsk, because they were foundational people in the PDP approach to mind, the parallel distributed processing approach to mind. They published that 2-volume set, which really laid down much of the groundwork on how you teach neural systems to learn with more than one layer, more than just perceptrons that was talked about with Victor about a month ago. So how you move on to these kind of, and back propagation and lots of other techniques kind of come in here. But the reason that people are calling Geoffrey Hinton the godfather of AI is because his work was the inspiration and lays at the background of the deep learning paper I'm going to forget the authors, Benugo and somebody else that will come back in a second. Sorry, I haven't slept much. And much of this deep learning AI that we now see everywhere, not just in ChatGPT, not just in large language models, but in systems like the Google Lens, that we find in things like Amazon Alexa, that we find in things like apps that can scan your skin to see if you've got skin cancer, that we find in computational driving systems, that we find almost across the board in any number of applications, kind of have their history in this deep learning AI, which goes back to the early PDP systems of the late 1980s, early 1990s. And just to say a little bit about this, you could argue, and I probably would argue, there have been relatively few innovations of great moments since then, right? There have been a few innovations, a few very clever innovations, and I'm still learning about some of this. But lots of the theory and lots of the algorithms that are used have actually been around for about 30 or 40 years. So Okay, so probably the moment when many people kind of realize that these deep learning systems are kind of doing something rather miraculous was certainly in the Eastern world, certainly in China, Korea, Japan, and nearby countries, was when AlphaGo was able to beat Lee Sedol in a match in 2016. This is very much like a bit of a replay of what happened with Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov, except, as I won't belabor this, but as we know, Go is a much more complex game, seems to be more closely related to, you know, questions of intuition and seeing shapes and seeing patterns in things that perhaps you don't really need to play a good game of chess. Many people thought you wouldn't be able to build a system that could beat a champion in Go, much less the world champion, one of the greatest players of all time. And so and you can watch this video, the video I showed to my students who have a related course in this undergraduate course. I've maybe told a couple of you this before, but people were crying in my class when they watched this video, because there's a moment when Lee Sedol looks at the board, a move that, you know, through the proxy of this other Go player makes a move for Deep Blue, and it's a move he completely doesn't expect. He sits there for about 3 minutes in silence, looking at this thing, utterly shocked. And it's kind of an amazing moment, because it's made a move that he would never have thought of. So it's made a creative move. It's historically creative move. There is a very small code to this that probably I don't really have time to go into, but there's a fantastic. So some people have been using, what do we call them? Oppositional algorithms? No, red queen is a strategy to build systems that can, if you like, take down systems like AlphaGo using AI to find strategies to defeat AlphaGo. And now it's possible for a very basic player to take on at least this generation of systems and win with a very basic strategy, basically just make. And it seems that, you know, AlphaGo and its children at the moment have some fatal flaws that any kind of reasonable Go player can take on and actually beat them. So that's using kind of AI to take on these systems. And so there's some interesting stuff here about, you know, how a deep learning AI system plays these kind of games. You know, what are its kind of hallucinations it might have about when it's winning or not, and what its fragilities might be. But nevertheless, I think there's a good argument that there's something very powerful, and once again, a kind of existence proof of something that looks very intelligent. Go through this quickly, but there's been a few. Jason Stanley, summer 2022, won the Colorado State Art Prize with this painting. It wasn't a painting, of course, it was produced by the AI system Midjourney. Since this time, another artist, I forgot his name, about a month ago, won another big international photography competition. And after winning the competition, he gave back the prize and said, well, I did this with this system. And of course, once again, we're in this unstable place where even world experts in photography will choose a picture which is not a photograph, which is a deep fake of a photograph, over other people. I think, can't remember, it might be the Sony prize or something, but it's a big prize. This guy won. Even the experts can't see the difference. Luciano Floridi calls this non-reversibility. I mean, it's very closely connected with the Turing test in some kind of way, but what he doesn't want to say that, I guess. But this seems to be a case where people just can't tell the difference between the products of these creative AIs and things produced by humans anymore, in at least some cases. Okay, maybe signal moment, the one that the newspapers like the most, is Blake Lemoine. His LaMDA dialogue. He's a Google engineer working on their own deep learning dialogue system. This one's trained on dialogue. Lemoine makes lots and lots of claims. Sometimes it's difficult to know exactly how well founded they are. He claims that this sits. So when I've read up on this, LaMDA is supposedly trained on just on dialogue. So that's what makes it different from other types of system. Lemoine claims it's trained on everything. It's trained on all the text that Google has. He has since been fired by Google, not for that, but for making claims that he thought this system was sentient. I think his claims that these systems are sentient are wildly mistaken. And if you kind of understand what these systems are doing, if you think these are sentient, then sentience is not really what we thought it was, right? But maybe claims about sentience and consciousness are complex anyway, because we have at best kind of working definitions. But nevertheless, it probably did what Lemoine wanted it to do, which was it threw deep learning systems into the public eye and open up lots of questions about these systems. So maybe it was a public service in some kind of sense. I mean, Lemoine, we've known for a long time, you know, going back to Eliza, that human beings will play around with even very basic systems and kind of impute intentionality to them and see that there's more going than there is. Eliza is a very, very basic system that just asked questions of users that, you know, just evoked more speech, that, you know, asked them to tell them about themselves. People liked interacting with it. People tended to project a lot more intelligence onto it. This is 1964, 1966. You know, so we now have something that really does look like AI in a certain kind of sense. And it's not surprising that people impute more intelligence to them than perhaps they have. But it does open a whole bunch of questions about what intelligence is and what intentionality is and what real meaning is and what the use of meaning is and what sentience is and what consciousness is, and whether any of these concepts can really be applied to robots. So they're kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm not really going to go into this because some of this is getting a bit out of date, but, you know, 2021, GPT-3 might have been 3.5, writes an article for The Guardian. There's a bunch of stuff said about this article that was written by GPT-3, which in some sense is not wholly accurate. And if you've messed around with these systems, you know, to produce text now, you know probably what the story is. You ask it a question, it produces some text. You edit that text a bit or put some other text on there that you've done from another question. You stitch something together, you can get something coherent. It's still very, very difficult, though not impossible, to get the system to write a finished article. It's more like, you know, we're now talking about prompt engineering. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, right, where people work on, and I get one on my phone every day. Here's the way to write prompts. You know, this is becoming a huge thing. Prompt engineering is a way to evoke interesting stuff from these machines. So in many ways, it is wrong to think about them, at least at the moment, as fully autonomous systems. They're not fully autonomous systems. But there are systems that you can throw something at and they will then send something back, and you can do this kind of dialogical process that can produce something very interesting, including Guardian articles, including student undergraduate essays, including probably in the future gradings of student undergraduate essays. I mean, you know, one of these systems also passed, I believe, in theory, passed an American bar exam. You know, increasingly they will be tailored to individual bits of text, so you can do more and more with them. You know, individual corpuses. So the limits of these are thoroughly unknown at the moment. But in many ways, as I've already indicated, the big E here is probably emergence, because I do not think, at least I'm trying to find it, I do not think even somebody like Geoffrey Hinton has been the sort of voice in the wilderness all the way through saying connectionism will do everything, right? Connectionism of the sort we built will do everything. It's been saying that for the last 30 or 40 years. But even Geoffrey Hinton, I don't think, thought that these systems would do as much as they have so quickly. And you can partly see that by the fact he's just quit his job at Google because he thinks it's a bit out of control. So that's interesting as well. So what are these systems? I mean, probably running a little bit out of time, but I'm going to go through this really quickly because I think this is in there. But connectionism, right? They are connectionist systems, but big and deep. They are connectionist systems with GPT 3.5, I think it was, had 1.75 billion connections, right? That's a massive number of connections. When I used to build neural nets in the early 2000s, we were talking about 20 neurons to do some quite clever things with about 400 connections. You know, orders of magnitude, not quite the human brain yet, but approaching those kind of things. So, you know, scale, size does matter here. Scale is very, very important. And it seems that just having this massive amount of scale can do new things. I mean, depth is important. One of the technical innovations, you can call it scientific innovation, was really how to build these multi-layer neurons. And I'm still learning a lot about this, about how these convolutional neural nets work. I mean, much of the technology in some ways is old. There are a few new things, but really, many of the deep learning neurons are still using something like backpropagation, really, which was one of the earliest discoveries about how you can train a multi-layer neural net. But there's lots of other things in there, lots of other ways of customizing. Much of it, despite what people have said, particularly where Sejnowsk and Hinton are concerned, are driven by innovations and, in the brain are driven by understandings of how the brain works and, 40 years of neuroscience. Okay, so connectionism, but deep, right? So according to Wolfram of, I think it's mathematical fame, I hope I haven't got the wrong mathematical tool. There are about 400 core layers involved in ChatGPT. I mean, I've read 200 in different places. There's a lot of layers compared to what we had, right? Even compared to the human brain, where you're talking about dozens of layers at most, probably. Lots of neurons, but not many layers, maybe. 175 billion connections, as I've already said. I mean, I quite like mentioning Dall at this point, which is the Chinese version of ChatGPT, which we don't talk about much in the West. Dall means the road to awareness. So you can kind of see where they might be going with this, or at least where they want to be going. This has 1.75 trillion parameters, right? Which is 3 orders of magnitude bigger than ChatGPT 3.5. It's trained on Chinese, English, and images. I haven't seen much in the West about what this thing can do, but it seems to be very widely deployed. It's only trained on 1.2 terabytes of Chinese text and 1.2 terabytes of English text. I believe ChatGPT was trained on 45 terabytes of English text and some graphics and stuff. So there are differences. It's also got a slightly different algorithm. But once again, the algorithms and the systems that are used to build these things are not unknown, right? This is a kind of mistake. Most of this technology, most of the algorithms, most of the way these things are programmed have been well known for about 20, 30 years. So if China wanted to, or this system, it's not really China, although of course the state plays a big role in their private companies. If they want to build it according to the ChatGPT model, there's nobody stopping them. Let's put it like that. So even if it doesn't do what we might expect now, what the other system can, let's wait for the future a little bit. The other thing which has changed things, I've already hinted at, is all the data. There have been claims that Google's using all the data to, run its systems. I haven't seen them deny this, but there are lots of. I saw the American government yesterday are sponsoring a hackathon to try and find out what you can get back from some of this data, because the allegation or claim has been that all of our Gmail, think about Google, about 15 years ago, scanned all the books, right? They scanned all the books in the Library of Congress. And for a short while, they were kind of available online, actually. They say they're not using that text at least at some point, or you couldn't access it anymore. But there's a lot of text out there, and this is being poured through these kind of systems. So scale is important, right? Scale is very important. And it seems, again, that I wouldn't underestimate the scientific achievements, but the fact that you have very fast computers using multi-layer neural networks with some new innovations in how you can train them, and all of this data available really seems to make a difference. Scale matters. All it's doing is predicting the next thing. At least GPT-3, right? It's predicting the next. I've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to just blast ahead, right? So it just predicts the next thing. That's all it's doing. What's the next bunch of words? Go ahead. So let me try and get, but it's very surprising. Let's try and get to the bit that I was really saying I would talk about, right? So how might 4E cognitive science respond? I think 4E cognitive science, embedded, extended, inactive, embodied cognitive science, needs to have a response, because on the face of it, this is not how things should work, right? If you take the claims seriously, I think you should take them very seriously, right? Intelligent systems like us need to have bodies embedded in the world. They need to be actionable. They need to do things, right? And you could argue, and I have argued, and I certainly will argue in a forthcoming paper, that this is something like 0E cognitive science in some ways. Now you could have an argument. You could have given. I haven't got slides in this, but you could give an argument that they are extended in a sense because we're extending them, right, with our interactions with them. And there are other reasons. I think it's very hard to argue that they're embodied. That if embodiment means anything, I don't think that they're embodied, these systems. They're implemented in the computer, but by that, any algorithm anywhere would be embodied, and the claim of embodiment becomes so wishy-washy, it's of no interest whatsoever. You could claim they're embedded, and there are some very interesting. This is the one I'm most I'm not so sure about, because they're embedded in the world of text, right? There is this huge amount of text which they're interacting with, not even interacting very much, kind of just crawling through, right? And I had some very interesting, last time I gave a version of this talk was actually to Andy Clark's group at University of Sussex. And he had a very nice phrase that it's like fossils of language that they're interacting with. You know, it's all of this text, which the internet age has made available online, which is, you know, is their embedding, if you like. I think so. You could say it's like half an E if you want to go down that route. What's the other? Yeah, I think. Oh, is it inactive? No, it's not inactive. Clearly not in any sense of inaction, because there's no action going on here in any meaningful way. If these systems are inactive, once again, the term inaction has little or no meaning. So I think the E which is most pertinent in these cases is that I've already said, probably emergence, right? But that wasn't one of the core E's. I mean, but the emergence of systems through scale is a very interesting thing. I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to jump. There's lots of reasons that I don't think these systems are. So look, I'm going to jump to this. There are three options. Let me see if I've got this slide right. Yeah, there are three options you could take. As I've already said, the first one I'm not very sympathetic to, but I'll talk briefly about. And so the idea is that we will continue to do this kind of methodological task, which is very important to what Dan Hutto and Eric Wang call rectification, which is trying to get rid of all the representational talk from cognitive science. I think this has run out of road, this program now, I'm going to claim. I think this program, although it's been hugely influential in philosophy and to extent in other parts of the cognitive science, it's not going to make any sense. Why? The existence proof. It seems like you can have, let's say, a zero-E intelligence or a zero-E system that does lots of stuff that looks cognitive. But worse than that, maybe I'll come on to this. I'll just jump ahead to the slide about this. Worse than that, rectification, get rid of representational work, is very misguided, I believe, in this context, partly because the assumptions of these systems are shot through with representations at every level, right? If you look at the people who were actually coming up with the ideas that have driven deep learning, so in a sort of historical philosophy of science sense, they were talking about representations. Like, there's a whole bunch of papers that maybe I cite somewhere. No, I don't know where. Yeah, I mean, look, these are the early PDP papers. You know, there's LeCun, Benjo, and Hinton, deep learning. But Hinton, along with, you know, McLennan and Ramelhart and Smolensky and other people, were doing what they called at the time sub-symbolic or PDP systems, which were thinking about how you build neural systems with many, many representational assumptions. Much of that science is exactly the science of these systems. So I don't see how this goes forward. I mean, I found at least one paper, you know, I won't go into this actually. I think there's a lot of straw manning you can already see going on here. And the main straw man tactic is to say something like, oh, cognitivists say that these systems have symbols in them. There's no symbols. That's rubbish, I'm sorry. But the whole, in this case, these are not symbolic representations, they're sub-symbolic or non-symbolic representations. The two are, conflating the two is just a big mistake. And it's a straw man strategy, really, to say. You know, and I think, who are the new radicals today? There's a nice quote I like from Lenin, which I'll do again. One must always try to be at least as radical as reality itself, right? And we're going through a radical moment. And for all of our talk of radicalism in the past, we need to be at least as radical to understand these systems that we're now dealing with, even if it runs against some of what 4E cognitive science says. So that's the approach I don't like. The other approach, I've got Javier Brandion on here from the Basque Country. There's a whole bunch of other people I could have put on here, like Asico de Paolo, I imagine, or I need to talk to about this. But there is an approach to these systems that just says, look, they're not autopoietic. I mean, I have some sympathy for this, actually. They're not biological, they're not autopoietic, they're not real agents. And as you've heard, I even have been making an argument a bit like this myself. And therefore, they can't be intelligent. Right? They can't be intelligent because intelligent is intrinsically, you know, close to the fragile. There's a whole bunch of concepts that we built up in activism and autopoietic and activism. I think the problem is, if that's right, then you've got these things that look intelligent via behavior or doing intelligent things. They just don't fit the theory. So you could play. So there's different ways of playing. There's different ways of playing this. I mean, Xavier had a very nice phrase, which again is a bit like the fossil, which is, he called these systems Derridian monsters. So you could think of, Jacques Derrida and consuming text and turning out other text. This is like a Derridian monster. It's a Derridian system on steroids. It takes all the text, spits out more text, doesn't understand any of it, right? I think it's a reasonable argument, but I think we have to be a bit more nuanced and circumspect about what do we mean by understanding, what do we mean by meaning, and all these kind of things. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this approach as well, but I do see something in it. Another one of my Dall-E creations. This time it's Wittgenstein trapped in a language game after Gustav Klimt or something like that. Anyway, so position 3, and I've almost run out of time, I think Klaus is telling me. So position 3 is just, well, a lot of this stuff, we can just, so I'll do it very quickly. We can bring back the representations, right? There has been a long history, although sometimes it gets pushed to the sidelines in a certain kind of sense, of thinking, yeah, Fourier cognitive science makes a lot of sense, but the real mistake is to say that the intelligent systems aren't representational. And I think we've seen this in the background already for the last few years, with people working on predictive processing, like Andy Clark is my favorite, because he has a particularly sort of an active, embodied version of predictive processing. Now we've got, it's talking about generative systems. It's been talking about generative models. So the brain and the nervous system, sometimes the entire body is conceived as a kind of integrated generative system that's just generating, in this case, behavior. And I think there's every reason to think that you could repose these systems, maybe train in a slightly different way, as we've already seen with things like cars, where generative systems can be used to run action-oriented robots like us in some way. So I think, I don't think this is the time to abandon Fourier cognitive science, but Fourier cognitive science may be telling us quite a bit about what's missing here. And I can come back to some of this stuff if you want. I have just one. Okay, I'm going to throw in one last thing. That last time I gave a version of this talk, I was in Brighton, Andy Clark's group. I was taken out to a very nice sushi restaurant afterwards, and then we went on to Andy's favorite whiskey bar, and we ordered a whiskey. And so Anil Seth, who's got the science book of the year, also came along, and he managed to get to the front of the queue, or perhaps second in the queue, and he ordered a whiskey, which had a very, very long recommendation by the person in the bar, and he ended up with, I think it was called, I haven't got it on here, but the second, it ended up with a particular whiskey. So one of Andy's PhD students, Ben White, was also there, and he just got BARD, which is the new deep learning large language model system on his phone. So we asked the system, what would you have to drink if you were in a whiskey bar in Brighton? And it came back with 3 recommendations, and the middle recommendation, the middle price one, was exactly the one that Andy Clark had just been offered by this guy in the bar, out of about 200 or 300 whiskeys. So that is the uncanny valley of the mind, right? These systems can do things which are just surprising, and we need to account for them. And that's it.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.